Well, I'm hot off the heels of writing my final exam through Adam Ellenboss's Nightlight Astrology Hellenistic Natal Chart course, and finding out I passed and feeling kind of pleased with that. And I'm also a bit, for one thing, self-conscious of whether this is too much astrology in one day. Perhaps I'll just record a bit of this video now and do the rest later. Um, And also, I'm facing my own things about these videos. Are they too long, perhaps? The other one was about 2 hours long. I'm thinking about trying to make this a bit more brief. I don't think I need to go into as many of the definitions of the houses for this one, because it'll just start to get redundant, trying to explain the houses on their own for each of the videos. Now we can focus more in on the signification of combining the houses with different signs. So anyways, so here we have Taurus Rising. Taurus is represented by the bull, and I think it's interesting to note the symbolism of the bull or the cow. In parts of India, the cow is considered to be a holy animal, and apparently there's something about Taurus that represents the bull as a sacrifice. And if you think back to the Babylonian era where this may have come from, the tradition of sacrificing a bull in the springtime for the growing season as an offering for the agricultural season ahead. And I kind of wonder if this similar theme is kind of in the background of bullfighting, because there is a kind of a ritualistic, sacrificial kind of act in that. And, I mean, not to say that I condone animal sacrifice or violence against animals in the form of bullfighting or anything like this, but what can I say? This is we're doing Hellenistic Astrology here, so we have to get right into. I'm just kidding. That's what also kind of. I mean, it's Scorpio season as well. So I'm perhaps the dark and the grim is coming to the forefront. I don't know. I'm Scorpio rising, so it could just be part of my style or something. So moving on. Here is the table that I've done, which shows the joys of the houses, and you can match them up with the rulers of the signs here. And in the last video for Aries, none of the rulerships of Aries matched up with the joys of the houses at all. But here we can see that Cancer in the third house is ruled by the moon, and the moon finds its joy in the third house. So I'm not actually sure if this is something that the Hellenistic astrologers paid attention to or not, but this is more of my own kinds of inquiries into astrology and why I find astrology to be an interesting thing to play around with. Not even just the playing around with trying to do charts and readings, but playing around with the actual system in itself is kind of fascinating, because you can look for little patterns like this. So here, a Taurus rising has a naturally strong Cancer third house position, because they both resonate with that archetype of the moon. And likewise, as we move down, you can see near the bottom there in the 11th house, the sign of Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, and the Jupiter finds its joy in the 11th house. So you already have two of these signs where the rulerships work out pretty nicely with the joys. However, I think it's also interesting to note this table. I could have I mean, it's not showing all the information in this table. I'm not showing the detriments, exaltations, falls, etc. But straight away, there's some things like Virgo. Venus has its fall in Virgo, so when Virgo is in the fifth, that's the joy of Venus. That strikes me as not being really the best matchup for the fifth house. That a Virgo fifth house is, you know, you're getting some strengths here with the third and the 11th, but I would say that a Virgo fifth would be kind of a weak spot in the Taurus Rising chart. And maybe to some extent as well the Libra one, because it's Mars finds its joy in the sixth, whereas Mars is in detriment in Libra because it's a Venus sign. However, I mean, it's kind of, when it comes to the malefics finding their joys, it's kind of, I think it's questionable whether it's actually a good thing for the malefics to have their joys. Because, I mean, if the topic of the sixth house is like strife and injuries, if Mars isn't as joy in the sixth, I mean, I'm gonna have to look at, as I continue my astrology practice, to look at more examples of this in real life. But I would imagine that Mars having its joy in the sixth would mean that, oh great, just lots of accidents and violent injuries and fights and hard manual labor. It's not really the best. If maybe Venus was there, it would actually do some good or something, right? I don't know. I don't know. Well, that's more the hunch that I'm going for, anyways. And likewise, there's some other problematic areas here. Ninth house is the joy of the sun, whereas ninth house in the Taurus chart is ruled by Saturn. So that's not a good matchup. The Saturn and the sun are kind of diametrically opposed. Saturn as being the coldest planet, the farthest planet from the sun that's visible to the naked eye, they're kind of seen at opposite ends of the spectrum. So you get a bit of an opposite thing going on there, and with Aries in the 12th, Saturn has its join in the 12th, and if you watched the video I did on Aries Rising, we looked at the chart of Hunter S. Thompson, who had Saturn in fall in Aries in the first house. And that didn't, I mean, yeah, I'm getting the impression that Saturn in its fall in Aries is a pretty difficult placement, or can make for some pretty chaotic recklessness and stuff like that. So that would also be a difficult area. So this is my little doodle that I did. This time I decided I'd include the little graphics, glyphs of the planets in here as well. So this is kind of a visualization for a technique called like ingirding. And this is from one of the reasons why I've been drawn to Hellenistic astrology is that as far as I know, I don't think anyone in a modern astrology style is using this technique, let alone knows about it at all. You have to have some exposure to the work of Project Hindsight or the school of traditional Hellenistic astrology, I'd imagine anyways. If there's somebody who's more of a traditional style that's watching this and is well acquainted with like and girding, you can let me know, I guess. But yeah, so it's creating a system of linkages in the chart that, before, when you're looking at, if you're just doing the typical style of astrology, you might look at the aspects between planets, connecting them. But I've noticed that there's a lot of styles of astrology that don't even really pay attention to depositors or domicile. I mean, I won't get too much into this, but I do think it's kind of cool to sketch out some visual representations of this, so you can see how the rulerships are matching up, and it actually creates a bit of a pattern in a way that suggests there's a kind of order or symmetry to the rulership scheme. And you can see that too if you look at how they're laid out on the wheel, but we won't get into that now. So, I won't talk too much about the house definitions on themselves, but I'll talk a bit about Taurus. It's a yin sign. It's fixed. It's earth. And if you think about the stereotypes that come with Taurus usually, this is where these ideas come from. Mainly the idea that Taurus is a stubborn kind of sign that's kind of set in their ways, that's hard to change their mind or convince them of things. That comes from it being a fixed sign. The yin, when it comes to the feminine yin, another way you could put it is day or night. I wouldn't get too hung up on the gender stuff here, because I think if you understand the ideas of yin and yang, yin is more of a resting, kind of receptive, listening kind of thing, whereas yang is more active, more action oriented, more extroverted, where yin is more introverted. And in this sense, Taurus Rising might be more of a homebody, might be more into downtime or just chilling out, kind of relaxing. They're, with the Earth too, they could have a very down to earth, I was trying to think of a better way to put it, but a down to earth energy that's kind of they're not. It's not going to be as high wired as an Aries rising. It's going to be a bit more chill. I would say it's ruled by Venus, so with Venus ruled sign in the first house, I mean, this all depends on a lot of factors, like what's going on with Venus in the chart, but there's a possibility for the Taurus rising to be considerably attractive, because you've got the planet that is associated with beauty ruling Taurus as a sign. It's also the exaltation of the moon. So this is like a very feminine sign. So it could be a feminine look. Could be kind of interesting to compare. I'm not quite confident though about using the signs to designate physical appearance. We'll have to test this out. I'm not sure if the people I've chosen for charts to look at are the men I've chosen. I don't think they're necessarily feminine by having these planets, but this is something that could, depending on the actual chart itself. So Taurus, like in girding, connects with the 6th house here. So the 6th house has to do with, again, I don't want to get into too much of the definitions for not taking too long with this, but health, work, in the more manual, menial sense. So one thing you could say is that the health of the Taurus individual is going to be a major focus of what they're putting their time and energy and attention into. They could be like a self-care regime is very important to Taurus rising. And the thing about it is that with this connection between the 1st and the 6th, is that I'm going to talk astrology here, so if you get offended by this, if you're a Taurus rising, again, take it with a grain of salt. Don't take it too literally. But what I get from this is the connection between the first and the sixth. If a Taurus rising person has problems with their health, it's kind of like they drop the ball. It's in their hands because that's what the first house represents. And with that connection with the sixth, it's like if you're healthy or not healthy, it's not something that's out of your control. It's like your own efforts to keep up whatever it is, your exercise, having a healthy diet, or whatever you need to do. It's like it's kind of like it's in your ball. You're part of the court. The ball's in your court, and it's up to you, your health, basically. There could also be some sort of there's some of the responsibilities of like doing the chores around the house, or the more manual tasks or something like that could fall to the Taurus native with this signification, with this matchup of the first and the sixth. Second house, Gemini. So Gemini, here we have a yang masculine air sign. Um, the basic idea of wealth with Gemini, this person, depending on how Mercury is placed in the chart, they could have the opportunity to be a kind of a wheeling and dealing merchant or a businessman. I'm thinking like bartering, trading, making, like maybe even like a auctioneer or something like this. Or it's like, or at least you go to people who do the haggling over, trying to talk the guy down into giving you a better deal or something like this. This is very, when you put Gemini in here in the second house, that's what I would associate. I could also say like, um, it it could even have the potential to be maybe a bit of a trickster or a con artist when it comes to money. If somebody's a Taurus rising person, I mean, this all depends on the individual and the chart and stuff like that, but there's probably one of the shadow parts of this could be somebody who's, the two-facedness of Gemini, right? They present themselves as being on it, trying to earn your trust, but they're running off with your money here. Um, it could also be with something with the wealth. The whole idea of trade and transaction is accentuated with Gemini. There's something about it, the mutable nature, I would say, that the money is changing hands. The money is being traded around. There's open commerce kind of thing. Um, and so this matches up with the fifth house, Virgo in the fifth. And obviously, what comes straight to mind with this, gambling could be an issue here. The person might get associate having fun with something to do with playing with money when you've got that second and fifth link. Or what they do for fun might cost. They might have expensive hobbies. That could be another one. Um, it could be somebody. It could be also be not just gambling, but also like, I guess, well, betting on sports is gambling. Um, okay, I guess that's enough. As you can tell, I'm just trying to like do this by memories, and I'm not I'm kind of going with the freewheeling flow on this one. Um, I think that's probably good for a second house Gemini, though. Third house, siblings, neighborhood, and we've got Cancer. So this is what I was talking about in the beginning, about the joy of the moon and ruled by the moon. So this is a particularly strong matchup, and the moon, again, this Cancer's a feminine sign. The moon is seen to be the masculine, or the feminine counterpart to the masculine sun. And it being a water sign, there's a certain element of emotional compassion, then the warmth of interpersonal relationship and connection. Cancer often has a very motherly theme associated with it. And so, you could say that the person who has Cancer in the third house may take a kind of like motherly role to their siblings, to their neighbors. They could be maybe hosting dinner parties and inviting people from the local community over and making sure everybody's comfortable and happy and well fed, and has that thing of a kind of a warm, compassionate attention to give people their time and listen to them. And somebody who's around in the neighborhood, they'd be very friendly with the shopkeepers and the everybody who's around. So this is part of why I think it's interesting to look at the matchups between the joy of the moon in the third and the rulership of the moon in Cancer. There's also something with Cancer representing the peak of summer, or the beginning of the summer, the peak of the daylight of the year. That there could be something about it. Everything's growing in the summer. It's everything's. All the people are out on the streets, and there's kind of this fullness that's represented with Cancer. And so, I mean, it could, it all depends on the chart, but it could represent a very full, rich life in the community, in the neighborhood. Maybe having lots of siblings, or having a kind of a rich connection with the siblings. It's the fall of Mars, so it's the whole thing. It's all about harmonious interaction with the neighborhood, the community, the family. And if Mars has its fall there, because it's, you don't want to, mess up a nice thing like that. But if somebody did have Mars in third house Cancer, it could, that would start to take a wrecking ball to the nice picture we've created, of all this harmonious, friendliness. The Mars there would really mess things up. So, and again, I'm with this lichen girding scheme. I am connecting the moon with the sun, being the two luminaries, although they're not exactly the same planet, so it diverges a bit from the other forms of lichen girding. But with this, the Cancer is right next to Leo, so that leads into the fourth house, which we're going into next. And basically, there's something of the family and the neighborhood and the community. I would say that the family kind of extends outside the walls of the home like this, and there's some kind of presence of family in the community. Like, perhaps there's certain times where there's towns where there's the founding families of the town that have really made a presence in the community. And I would kind of get something like this from this matchup. So, we've already talked about the family. There's also the home itself, the ancestry, the private life, the father. And so, with Leo being matched up here, it could say something very much about the father. Oftentimes, the sun can be used as a kind of significator for the father. So, it is an interesting way to match up the fourth house. There's Leo has that thing traditionally associated with the king. It's kind of got that regal quality. So, I would have to. It would be interesting to look at the charts of different people with Taurus rising to see how the Leo fourth plays out in it. Um, but I mean, basically, it suggests it kind of get the image of somebody who's like the little princess or the little prince that comes from a a lineage of some sort of like there's a sense of regality in the family, right? But I'm kind of curious about this because obviously not everybody. I don't know. It's not going to play out as like privilege, family privilege for everybody. But maybe it depends on how the actual what is actually going on in the chart and the circumstances of the individual there. Um, but there's something the family it would be, there's got to be some kind of wealth or something to draw from the ancestry if Leo is there because it's kind of like you've got royal blood. It's kind of like what it suggests as like an archetype. You may not literally have royal blood, but that's kind of what the direction we're going here. It's kind of like you're coming from a long, it could be the family pride as well. That there's um, some people are more into this than others. I've noticed some people, they might get a twinkle in their eye when they're talking about their stories of their dad or their grandpa or something like this, and they might have like whatever like it becomes the family myth or something like this. Um, no, I mean, yeah, I'm speaking kind of my Jungian influences showing through here. I don't mean myth in the idea of falsity, but myth in that the roots of the family take on a mythic dimension. That there's something, um, there's some sort of significance in the past, in the where you come from. It may be a romance that's involved with going back to the place where your ancestors immigrated from, if that's the nature of it, or some sort of pride in the local in the pride of your traditional culture of your ancestors would be, I would say, very emphasized in the Taurus rising chart. The fifth house in Virgo. Yeah, so this is what I was saying with joy of Venus versus the fall of Venus. Basically, with Virgo in the fifth house, my concern is that um, a person may be too self-critical of what it is that they make. Because that is, I mean, maybe I'm going with Virgo stereotypes here, but the hell with it. I mean, Virgo is detail oriented. It's ruled by Mercury. It's kind of like I do think that Virgo has this thing about planning because it's all about the end of summer and kind of looking into the yin side of the year and it's not really the best sign for having fun, and so I kind of worry that the Taurus rising individual depends on the chart, of course, but there's this tendency here to maybe take things too seriously. Like if they get involved in things like like play and leisure and sport, they're going to be taking the competition too seriously and trying to perfect everything. The technique of their sporting ability or what it's more serious. It's not so much about having fun. Um, and likewise, like sometimes if you're an artist, you're a musician, like it can be a drag. It's like you're a writer and you're like the classic image of the guy who just keeps throwing the paper into the baskets because I just can't write anything. It's all crap, right? I kind of get this kind of problem coming up with this matchup. It could also be like if the Taurus rising individual as a parent is going to have to look out for being too critical of their children, too like you're gonna have to give your kids some slack is basically the message here in terms of children, because otherwise, yeah, you or I'm thinking it could also be perhaps like the Virgo parent, or not the Virgo parent, but the Virgo fifth house parent, the Taurus rising parent, would be kind of micromanaging their children, trying, the helicopter parent thing, and it connects here with the second house through lichen girding. It could be, we already talked about it from the point of view from the second house, and there being something to do maybe with gambling that could come up with that connection with Gemini and the second house. I was also saying that, like, there could be, like, spending the leisure would have to do with, like, spending money, like gambling or expensive hobbies. It could also, I mean, you have to look at the chart. Another issue could be, like, the person doesn't have fun in their life because they're afraid to spend money. I mean, you have to, like, sometimes you might be going too far in one direction and not enough in the other. So, I mean, it could go either way, potentially. Like, that could be a kind of a bit of a conflict. You have to see that the second house and the fifth house are at a 90-degree angle to each other. So these houses are inherently square. Like, and that could be seen as, like, if you have children, it's going to cost you money. It takes money to have children, right? So children are going to be expensive. If you want to have fun, if you want to go on dates, if you want to, like, go to the hockey game, I'm a Canadian, so I'm thinking hockey here. Or if you want to, like, I play music, so I'm thinking spending money on synthesizers. This is, my square between the second and fifth, perhaps, right? But yeah, like, if you're gonna have the second and the fifth connected, there's an inherent square angle there, which adds a kind of tension, and it could be either spending too much money, having fun, or not having fun because you're too tight about your wallet. I could do more. This is what's coming to mind right now, anyways. Sixth house, the house of bad fortune and illnesses and servitude and such. With Libra there, if you remember that Libra is represented by the balancing scales, and it's a Venus-ruled sign. The whole thing about the balancing scales is because it's in between. It marks the beginning of autumn, so end of summer, beginning of autumn. So it's the kind of in-between point of what they call the yang part of the year, the spring and summer, and the yin part of the year of the autumn and the winter. Did I say that right? Anyways, okay. What my point here, though, is that the illnesses of a person could be caused with something being out of balance. That, and again, what we're saying about the fifth house, maybe, too much work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Or it could be, the work, leisure, work, rest, balance would be an obvious one for a lot of people, I would think. Yes, and what else? With Libra's a kind of a self-sacrificing sign, and you can kind of see that with the exaltation of Saturn, the fall of the sun. It's the Libra in the sixth is like you're doing work for the benefit of others. It's like it could be like volunteer work or something like that, where you're not really getting paid, but you're doing some stuff as an act of service. So, I mean, it could, it could fall into stuff like karma yoga or something like that as well. But I think there's a risk here where the Libra in the sixth, the Taurus rising person is putting, if you put the needs of others before yourself too much, you might only run yourself into the ground, basically. And that's a kind of a warning that I would see with this matchup. And it connects to the first house, so yeah, I think, these kind of things of like taking time to focus on self-care and stuff like that, and not to overwork yourself, that could be a theme here. Oh boy, seventh house in Scorpio. You're the Taurus rising individual. I think the seventh house is an interesting one because what I'm noticing, especially with using Hellenistic astrology, is I think that the seventh house is going to represent what kind of partners show up in your life, and here you're going to wind up probably with some Scorpio-esque partners, which you might be in for trouble because the Scorpio tends to have a bad reputation compared to most of the other signs in the zodiac. Now, why does Scorpio have a bad reputation? Well, rather than... I'm not going to trash talk Scorpios here. We're going to just look at the fact of the matter of the dignities of Scorpio is that it's ruled by Mars, the lesser malefic, and it's the detriment of Venus and the fall of the moon. So it's not a good sign for emotional security. It's not a good sign for being friendly and just getting along. It sort of has the association of being a kind of dark and broody kind of sign. But, if you're a Taurus rising individual, this could mean, like, what could I say? Like, cute goth girls or something? Or cute goth boys? I always associate Scorpio with the whole goth thing more than any other sign. I think that I'm not, I'm probably not the only one who makes that association straight up. Scorpio is a sign of Halloween. Your boyfriend is going to look like Dracula, basically. What can we say? Okay, I'm even getting off track here. Okay, there's also this whole, like, sex thing with Scorpio. Scorpio rules the genitals. It's got this sort of Mars sexual energy. Could be hot and steamy sex. So it could be... The whole thing about the Scorpio in the 7th house is it's going to be charged and passionate and dramatic, and you're going to have fights, and then you're going to make up, and then you're going to break up and get back together, and you're going to want to kill each other, and then... But that just... Then... Or, no, I don't know. Like, this is kind of what I'm getting from this anyways. It might be worse... it might be worse than that. It might be... your ex might turn into like a stalker or something, and you have to get a restraining order. He's probably going to want to listen to like Marilyn Manson all the time. God, okay, I really should take a break here. But before we end, before I take a break. Just to like the icing on the cake of the Scorpio in the 7th house is that with lichen girding, it matches up with the 12th house. And the 12th house has to do with things like hospitals and prisons and stuff like that. So your significant other may also be a criminal or condemned by the psychiatric system. This is... we're not... I don't know. I'm probably not getting... I'm probably... I'm having fun with it anyways. I don't know if I'm doing too hard on... This is... I've got Scorpio ascendant, so I'm... don't take it too hard if there's any other Scorpios that are listening to this. It's sort of... This is in a way of self-deprecating humor. You shouldn't be that associated with your zodiac signs anyways, right? We're trying to get out of this habit, but that's another story. Hello again. Before I move on from Scorpio and the 7th here, I think perhaps to take a more serious look at it, I think with the 1st and 7th specifically, it gets into this interesting idea of opposites, and I'm going to take a bit of a Jungian angle here. So I realize that I'm sort of subscribing, or I'm titling my stuff as Hellenistic Astrology, but to be honest, I'm not. I use Hellenistic for the techniques, but I'll still touch upon some of these modern psychological ideas. But Jung himself was really into astrology, and you can see how looking into these systems is probably where he started to develop these kinds of ways of looking at things. The first house, which represents the self-identification of the native, the 7th house represents the self-identification of the other. And the whole idea here is that the more self-identified you are with one thing, there necessarily is some kind of connected opposite which needs to balance out the representation so that it doesn't get too one-sided. What's also interesting, though, is that in terms of the elemental nature of opposition in astrology, is that when you take opposite signs from one another, in this case, Taurus and Scorpio, they're both what we call feminine signs, because both earth and water are considered to be of the yin or the feminine quality, whereas air and fire are of the masculine or yang quality. And every opposition that you get in a chart is either going to be between an earth sign and a water sign, or a fire sign and an air sign. And so, like, the idea is that they're opposite, but they're not completely unrelated. And there's this idea that with oppositions, things can only be opposite if they have something in common. Like, there's hot and cold are opposites, but they're connected because they both have to do with temperature. Light and dark are opposites, but they're connected because they both have to do with light, or the absence of it. Or loud and quiet has to do with sound. You can't have, like, when you start mixing it up with other things, it would be like, a property of something else. But you can't have, whatever. Like, you can't have, like, a turkey being the opposite of a bicycle. There has to be something in common between a turkey and a bicycle to make some kind of a comparison, or else it's just kind of nonsense. So, Scorpio and Taurus have something in common with being yin signs, being kind of more of the perhaps introverted, or of a more maybe emotional or grounded quality. There's also the opposition you can see between them is that they're ruled by Mars and Venus respectively, which are the classic kind of gender opposites for one thing. But they're both, Mars and Venus are kind of interconnected because they both have a bit more to do with the interpersonal reality of people, and one kind of represents perhaps the Venus, a more friendly, harmonious kind of interacting, whereas Mars is perhaps a bit more hostile and aggressive. But it's not to completely demonize it, because it has its own place, because sometimes you have to stand up about what's wrong, stand up for yourself, not get pushed around. fight for your rights. It's the two things are actually dependent on each other, and they have to work in balance. And so you got these kinds of things coming up with Taurus and Scorpio. If a person, like, the so I was some people are all into the whole, like, feel good, positivity, good vibes, that kind of stuff. And I think that's something you could probably see with the Taurus Scorpio dynamic, is that if you're heavily identified with being positivity, and just like, don't be a downer, don't be, no drama around here, we're just, like, there's gonna you're somebody in your life is going to represent the other of that, and you're gonna have to balance out by having a relationship with somebody who's more identified with the things you're not as identified with. And it creates a kind of, like, opposites attract thing, or it creates a kind of a interdynamic between these two different qualities playing off each other. And so that's perhaps a more mature look at the Taurus and Scorpio dynamic, rather than just talking about how goth Scorpio is. Eighth house. Now, the whole thing about this, again, with the 12-letter alphabet, it's so often, if people are talking about what Sagittarius is all about, it's all just ninth house stuff of, like, oh, they like to travel, and they're philosophers. But if you're looking for anything that's strictly just Sagittarius, and it's without these ninth house things mixed in, they do say Sagittarius is a bit, likes to party. And Jupiter kind of represents this permissive planet. It's sort of granting permission to things. It's I kind of was thinking about what to say for this, and I was thinking about, there's this attitude that people get with, like, pop spirituality. I'm not sure where this originated, but it's like, just say yes to everything. Just do this practice of saying yes to everything that comes up. That's a very Jupiter kind of attitude. And whether or not that works out, everybody's got different karma, and in this case, it's like that could actually probably get somebody in trouble, saying yes to everything and being a bit overly permissive, and you got to also think about, like, Jupiter. In myth, Jupiter, or Zeus, was most kind of notorious for sleeping around on his wife Hera. So there's this kind of thing about, like, the Sagittarius represented by the centaur, half man, half beast. It's kind of like the mix between this sort of, like, the higher noble and more of this animalistic that kind of balance in man. And I would say, basically, if the person is working, it's like, you gotta have fun, you gotta party, you gotta, blow off some steam or whatever. But if it's, for this person, if they need to have some level of restraint, it could be, or else, you don't want to have an accident and a drunken night out, or you don't want to overdose when you're partying. This is the kind of thing that I would see as a concern, just based on the Sagittarius connection with the 8th house. It could also maybe do with, like, being irresponsible with your money, or being overly generous, and like, there's a generosity thing with Sagittarius, but that could, either you're bailing out people, or you're you should be careful on don't be too overly confident or enthusiastic about, like, investments or different business partnerships. Shared finances, you might end up kind of, there's a sort of thing that the generosity of Jupiter here could indicate a kind of a loss through generosity. Not telling everybody to be a tightwad, but that kind of indicates a problem when it winds up in the 8th house like this. Um, so with Taurus like in girding, it connects to the 11th house, which is another Jupiter ruled sign, and we'll get into that when we get to the 11th. So this is again, I think it would indicate something to do with a getting financially involved with people in the peer group or in the community or whatever it is, making a kind maybe some kind of a group organization where people are pooling their money together, perhaps. Um, and it could also indicate trouble that comes from the involvement with different organizations or different groups. Um, so it could get, and you could be getting mixed up in the wrong crowd. It could be, you get kind of pulled into trouble or maybe crime or something like that based on the kinds of people that you associate with or kind of the crowd you're running with. Those kids will get you in trouble kind of thing could be a connection between the 11th and the 8th. Um, so ninth house. Oh, okay. This is an interesting one because you've got Capricorn in the ninth, and it's not. I wouldn't say this is really the greatest matchup because the ninth is the joy of the sun, and Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. You can see this with the arrangement of the rulerships. In traditional astrology, Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius, and opposite to these signs on the other end of the zodiac is Cancer and Leo, the signs of the two luminaries. So there's a kind of the opposition here is between Saturn and the luminaries. So it's not really the best ninth house sign. What makes this a problem, though? Why is this not a good ninth house sign? Well, ninth house is all about, it's kind of deriving meaning from life, getting a higher meaning to what it's all about and what's going on, having a richer understanding of the way things work, having an appreciation for maybe the mysteries of life and a deep study of all this. So you with Saturn there though, it's too serious, it's too somber, could even be cynical. Um, like this, it sort of suggests somebody who might have a bitter outlook on life. Their whole the kind of philosophy they're living by um, is formed perhaps by the hard circumstances they've had encountered in life, or perhaps they've had um, they've had an exposure to the darker things in life, and thus are more um, they're more informed by heavier topics and heavier experience in life. And I mean, we can't, I think we have to give Saturn its respect. We can't just say that Saturn is just a bummer and that it's bad if it's in the ninth house. But I just feel like sometimes if you meet people and they're coming from a place where it's not they're not it's they're spiritual. Well, I don't know. It's like spirituality ultimately has to have a connection to love and compassion, and I think the problem with Saturn is that too much of it there can be maybe a kind of a bitterness or resentment there, or like I mean, there's also perhaps even a sense of martyrdom, perhaps. Um, it's yeah, it's like Saturn is or the Capricorn represents the beginning of winter here, um, and with that kind of like you're in the darkest time of the year. Um, there could be a kind of illumination that comes from that, though, like the kind of um, when you're at your lowest, that's where grace finds you, kind of thing, um, and being in touch with a very kind of grounded spirituality that doesn't bypass the most the material side of life, or the cold, what we would say the cold hard reality, which I wouldn't take it too seriously, though, because that's just one side of reality. But there's some sort of very grounded and very somber appreciation for the gritty cold hard reality with this kind of placement. And it it's the exaltation of Mars, so that could also do with a very kind of practical but kind of cutting technical kind of ability. It could be somebody whose higher learning is like becoming a computer programmer, or setting up systems for working big companies or something like that. The person's it's this very practical, technical, maybe even side that might come out with a Capricorn ninth house. Um, and so it connects with the 10th. And so there's something about this attitude that would probably serve them in their career, in a practical application, but it's not the most, maybe not the most fun kind of application, but there could be a kind of a usefulness here, maybe. So, again, Aquarius, another Saturn sign, matching up with the 10th. Um, I probably keep repeating the same thing a lot, but I always get this association. My dad had a son in Aquarius, and he was a big volunteer kind of guy. He'd do a lot of work for community organizations like the Rotary Club, and the Rotary Club had a motto that was like service before self. And that, to me, that seems like it really kind of gets to what the Aquarian kind of mentality is about. Um, there's something about the job, the career, what the person is doing, that there is a kind of generosity there, but rather than a Jupiterian generosity, it takes more of the flavor of being more self-sacrificial, of 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 in a way, could be even like a kind of a spiritual connotation here, where it's the submission of the ego towards the needs of the collective. It's maybe taking on a bit of an austere lifestyle for the sake of something bigger, or doing some kind. I think the Aquarius in the 10th house, ultimately, if the person's going to find a career that means something for them, they're going to have to be it's not just going to be about serving their own needs, but of doing something that is going to make society better, or at least seems to promise that kind of direction to work in. And so there could be something, it could work for like politics or activism or environmental work, or I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of people who are involved in the veganism, anti-animal cruelty, or whatever. There's some sort of a social cause, perhaps, that motivates the person behind their job. Um, it could, I mean, and other forms of it too, depending how it could work. It could be somebody who's just, it could also be like this is more of a shadow one, you'd say, a lesser expression of it could be somebody who's just a lackey for somebody else's project. They're just, they don't really think for themselves. They're just taking orders or something like this. And that would be, putting yourself aside to work for something else, but it's not, sometimes you got to maybe ask the question, who is it that you're working for? What are you ultimately serving here? Is it really for the good of all beings, or are you just, serving the king kind of thing, right? And I mean, this brings up some big archetypal questions, like, if we talk about, the literal service of the king versus the archetypal, where the king represents something more than just some guy who's in power, in charge of everybody else, bossing something around, like maybe the more, but I'm kind of getting off on a tangent there. The Taurus, for the Taurus Rising, this matches up with the 9th house, which we just talked about. So I'm just going to keep going. Pisces in the 11th. So this is one where the joy of Jupiter matches up with the rulership of Jupiter. And what does this mean for the 11th house? Well, Jupiter finds its joy because it's a very generous and giving planet. It's a greater benefic, so it's a pretty supportive influence. And Pisces is its home in a water sign. So the sort of generosity and support that Jupiter brings when it's a water sign is going to be more emotional. It's going to be more of this creating a relational bond with people. And so compared to other signs that would match up in the 11th house, I would say that there's more of a kind of there's like a more it's the people that your in group is. They're not just people you have fun with, or people that you meet through work, or people that are involved in the studying the same thing. Your peers at school. There's a more of a supportive, maybe emotional connection or compassionate connection. People are maybe looking out for each other or caring for each other a bit more. And it also, Pisces, I think, has a strong spiritual connotation. There's this whole thing, I don't know about, I mean, this is open to interpretation, but Jung talked a lot about Pisces and this idea of the age of Pisces having to do with the figure of Jesus Christ. And so there is this kind of like fellowhood of man kind of theme I think that you get from Pisces in the 11th. Like, I think there's something that, the spirit is there whenever two or more of us meet, kind of thing. That the real spirituality comes in the sense of communion. There's a line, was it Thich Nhat Hanh, who says the next Buddha is going to be a Sangha. As in, so we're not talking about the individual as a realized prophet or Buddha, but the group, mind, the we space. So I think a deeper spiritual meaning of Pisces in the 11th will bring about these themes, which I think has the potential to be very positive. And you see the exaltation of Venus in Pisces also emphasizing this relational quality that's going on here. It could also, there's also a very strong possibility for art, I think, coming up in this. I think Taurus Rising itself is, because it's the exaltation of the moon and a Venus sign, it naturally has a tendency to the things which are beautiful. There's this sort of philosophical idea of the almost theological of the good, the beautiful, the true, and this can carry into an aesthetic appreciation in the arts, and the water quality bringing about the intuitive art making of bringing bringing the image out of the waters of the soul. If you want to put it in a snappy way. So Taurus, and with lichen girding though, it matches with the eighth. So there is perhaps a problem, especially with water signs. There can be a problem with substance use. It's sort of, if you think about, in tarot, water is represented by the cups. So you think about the cup as representing relational things, because it could be having a cup of tea with somebody, having a cup of coffee, going out for a date, spending some time at the bar with your friends, and that socialization. But I mean, that can also turn into just like, having benders or whatever, right? Or that, the person, there's such a strong pub culture in places like England or whatever, right? And I would associate some of the perhaps problems that would come up with this is maybe over drinking, or that kind of stuff that is tied in with social bonding in our culture, perhaps. The 12th house is a house of bad spirit, and it's the joy of Saturn. And when Aries is there, Aries is the fall of Saturn. So, I mean, I'm going to be straightforward with this. I wonder what people's take on this is, because one difference about Hellenistic astrology to modern astrology is modern astrology, people often take the attitude that there are no bad placements, that it's all just what you make of them, and that you can unlock the gifts of all of them and stuff like that. Well, I'm not completely disagreeing with that, like it's some kind of a dichotomy. One defining characteristic of Hellenistic astrology is that there are, in fact, bad placements and good ones. And so, if anybody has a problem with any of this, where it's talking about things which are definitely bad or definitely good, I'm sorry, this is Hellenistic astrology, and I'm just practicing a different style than what you're used to. And I've basically getting the impression that, I mean, this all depends on, this is not just every Taurus rising person has the same problem. It depends on what's happening with the relative planets in the chart. Like, is Mars in a good condition? Is Saturn in a condition? But there is a potential here. If Saturn is in the 12th, and if Mars is not very good itself in terms of its placement, it could be really nasty. Or, I mean, it could also be a kind of... It could be the... I mean... why is it... Okay, why is it nasty? Because Saturn in the 12th enjoys being there, because the Saturn is a limiting planet, and the 12th has to do with imprisonment and isolation. So when Saturn's there, it's going to be able to act that out. It's going to have a chance to do play out its role it plays in a way where it gets to do all the things it wants to do. And the character of Saturn is that it may be taken as being very painful and isolating, and it's a bad time, basically. That's why this is called the House of Bad Spirit. If Saturn is in its joy there, I'm thinking there might be at least some chance for I don't know, like, sometimes you gotta make the mistake to learn the lesson, kind of thing, right? So to me, it feels like that might be more of emphasized if Saturn is in its joy in the 12th, or if Saturn is well dignified. But if Saturn is poorly dignified in the 12th, what I'm kind of getting from this is some people in life, not everybody learns the lessons from their mistakes. There's some people who, in spite of everything, manage to keep fucking things up, pardon my expression, in the same way over and over again, and being they have their heads so far up their ass that they cannot, have any self-awareness of what they're doing wrong, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And this kind of to me, represents the problem of Saturn in its fall in the 12th. When we get around to looking at some of the charts I've selected, there is one of the people I've selected here does have this placement. Although I don't know him that well, so I have to do some studying here. And it would be interesting to talk. Maybe I'm being too hard on this particular kind of placement, but I'm just talking the pure astrology here before we look at any charts, right? So just to give you an idea of how the archetypes come together. And as I discussed before, this one matches up with the 7th. So it says something about the partner. It could say something about what kind of situation the partner's in. It could have something to do about the partner getting into trouble, or it could have something to do with the native getting in trouble through their partnerships. Or there could be a real dark side to the kinds of relationships or one-on-one friendships that the partner gets into with this kind of placement. Again, maybe this also, you can see the same thing happening with this, like, connection between Pisces and Sag with the 11th and the 8th, that there could, it's the pros and cons. There could be some good, emotionally supportive, nurturing connections, but there could also be the potential to get into some pretty serious trouble through the kinds of people that are in your life, either through the people in your group or the people you're in a more one-on-one relationship with. For an example chart to use, I've chosen Herman Melville, who's the writer of Moby Dick. Now, I can't say I've ever read Moby Dick, or that I really am all that familiar with Herman Melville, aside from Moby Dick having become a major kind of cultural. It's a pretty big book for American literature, so he's definitely staked out his place in the literary canon, I suppose you could say. So I didn't, just had to basically read his biography on Wikipedia here. So what you're getting with this is I'm gonna talk about what happened in his life, giving a short version anyways, and highlighting some of the things you see here in the chart. Starting from the beginning, one of the significant things that happened in the early part of his life was that his father had a problem with debt. So we can go to, I'll just read out what it says here. Alan Melville lived beyond his means, and on large sums he borrowed from both his father and his wife's widowed mother. Although his wife's opinion of his financial conduct is unknown, biographer Herschel Parker suggests Maria thought her mother's money was infinite, and that she was entitled to much of her portion while her children were young. How well the parents managed to hide the truth from their children is impossible to know, according to biographer Andrew Del Blanco. In 1830, Maria's family finally lost patience and their support came to a halt, at which point Alan's total debt to both families exceeded $20,000, which is the equivalent of $471,000, so nearly $500,000 by in American dollars by today's standards. So the parents were $500,000 in debt to the family for borrowing money and living beyond their means. However, they say that it wasn't all just like a dysfunctional family situation or anything like that, though. There's another part here that says, the felicity of Melville's early childhood, biographer Newton Arvin writes, depended not so much on wealth as on the exceptionally tender and affectionate spirit in all the family relationships, especially in the immediate circle. Arvin describes Alan as a man of real sensibility and a particularly warm and loving father. while Maria was warmly maternal, simple, robust, and affectionately devoted to her husband and her brood. So, with this, you've got, namely, if you're talking about problems with debts and inheritances and things like that, we're looking at the 8th house. He's got the moon in the 8th house, and the moon, it's got a whole sign aspect to Mars. It's, I guess it's about 9 degrees off, so it's not like what you'd call an orb. It's not by a tight orb. But the idea is that the moon is a pretty fast-moving object, so the chart represents a recent opposition between Mars in the 2nd and the moon in the 8th. And the moon, a general signification for the moon represents sort of the body, the family. It can relate to the environment. So it could be the environment you grew up in, or where you come from. These are all things we can tie with the moon. And Mars generally has a disrupting or damaging influence. So the kind of opposition between the 8th house family stuff, as indicated by the moon, and the 2nd house having that disruptive influence of Mars there, you can see that in the problems with the huge debt from his father. And what they said at the end of that is that they said that they were pretty nurturing parents in spite of all that. And you can see the Venus in the 3rd, perhaps in Cancer. And if you remember what I was saying in the earlier parts of the video about to be honest, the 3rd house, I would say, it's more typically associated with siblings than it is with the mother and father. But remember, there's also this connection. The 3rd and the 4th are both ruled by the luminaries, with like and girding. This could connect them in a way where there's a kind of a crossover between the things to do with the father and the things to do with the siblings, and the sort of warm, emotional, nurturing quality of Cancer, with Venus being there. Maybe you get the idea. So I think that kind of plays in nicely with that. So with his family basically going bankrupt due to his father's debts, after his father died, he basically got put to work as a kid. His father died, he was only like 12 years old, and so he's forced into work. And it's actually, it's kind of funny because it says, like, this is kind of a side note, but it says his uncle got him a job as a clerk for $150 a year, but that was equivalent to $3,800 in 2018, which is, there's a lot of people who are probably making less than that. So, but still, the being able to work as a child and having your father die and all this, it's kind of a heavy trip, and it says heavy kind of thing to live with. It says biographers cite a passage from Redburn when trying to answer what Herman must have felt then. So this is something that he wrote in a work of fiction, but it might represent what he was feeling at the time. I had learned to think much and bitterly before my time, the narrator remarks, adding, I must not think of those delightful days before my father became a bankrupt, and we removed from the city, for when I think of those days, something rises up in my throat and almost strangles me. Arvin argues Melville was forced to reckon with the tormented psychology of the decayed patrician. So, there's sort of like the bittersweet thing going on here, where on one hand there was sort of a sweetness associated with childhood, but what comes up in the if you look at so you've got this stuff with the 4th and the 3rd being ruled by Cancer, and that connects to the 8th, with the moon. So there you've got like the Venus in Cancer being a kind of a sweet and sentimental thing, but the moon's in the 8th, which is the house of death and inheritance and things like that, and that's getting this clash from Mars in the 2nd. Maybe you can follow along with what I'm pointing out there. And so, yeah, and I mean, he got pretty ripped off. It was saying that his when both their grandparents died, the only inheritance they got was $20, which was equivalent to $500 at the time. And so yeah, basically no inheritance, having to work from a young age. And then eventually there was a kind of a depression, financial crash in 1837 that forced his uncle to file for bankruptcy as well. And so you can see the same thing with the Mars, Moon, 2nd and 8th. You know, like you're getting helped out by your family, but then more of your family goes bankrupt. It's kind of a hard time. And then eventually he went into teaching, and after that his uncle went bankrupt, and he was even teaching some people his own age. And then he tried to get a job, or he sort of studying engineering and surveying, but there's a letter recommending him that his uncle wrote that says he possesses the ambition to make himself useful in a business which he desires to make his profession, but no job resulted. So like he was kind of trying to go for it, the engineering thing, but he couldn't make it work. So out of this whole mess where working from a young age, have these jobs not lasting or these prospects not working out, basically kind of desperate for something to do, that's what gets him into whaling. And that's basically the basis of what he becomes famous for, is he and his experience as a whaler or as a sailor becomes the kind of the basis for a lot of his writing, and that's ultimately his kind of his claim to fame. And part of what was going on was that after whaling for a while, he must have gotten sick of it or something, because he kind of he jumped ship, and I guess he sort of went AWOL for a while. There's a lot of this was around the Polynesian Islands, or the Pacific Islands, or however you'd want to talk about it, and so he ended up living in on some of these islands for a while, as like he said he was living as a beachcomber and an island roamer. He ended up writing a couple books based on his experiences living in some of these places, and he also ended up working on for the U.S. Navy on a Navy ship for a while. And that also influenced his writing. So there's a good quote here, though, I think. Melville's wander years created what the biographer Arvin calls a settled hatred of external authority, a lust for personal freedom, and a growing and intensifying sense of his own exceptionalness as a person, along with the resentful sense that circumstance and mankind together had already imposed their will upon him in a series of injurious ways. Scholar Robert Milder believes that the encounter with the wide ocean, where he was seemingly abandoned by God, led Melville to experience a metaphysical estrangement and influenced his social views in two ways. First, that he had belonged to the genteel classes but sympathized with the disinherited commons he had been placed among.
sorry, my cadence here, I'm kind of reading this out. He was sympathized with the disinherited comments he'd been placed among. The second was that experiencing the cultures of Polynesia let him view the West from an outsider's perspective. So, I think, so I was talking about the bad placement of Saturn in Aries in the 12th house, and this is interesting because that is where he's got Saturn here. He's also got the North Node in the 12th house, which is probably not a very good combination. I mean, that would add quite a quite an kind of a heavier signification for that, because that also marks where the eclipses happen. What we were talking about, he says that he's got a settled hatred of external authority, a lust for personal freedom, and a growing and intensifying sense of his own exceptionalness as a person. And what I would say is that maybe a well-dignified Saturn in a chart could have to do with a healthy sense of humility and responsibility and the necessariness of authority and all these kind of things. With disabled Saturn, like this one, it's a complete hatred of authority, a resentfulness of the circumstances you've been put in, the cards you've been dealt in life, and this kind of bitterness, like you've got a chip on your shoulder against God for putting you out on this awful whaling boat in the middle of the ocean and having all your family stuff go to hell, like that. I think whether or not this isn't ultimately was that destructive of a force, I mean, what can I say? It sort of represents, I don't know, how he's relating to the Saturn thing. He's got the Aries, the Mars, it's got this hot, martial, angry thing, and with Saturn there, it's like the hard circumstances of death and having to work from a young age and all the trouble in life. There's definitely a kind of a acidic bitterness maybe here. But it's also interesting that Saturn's retrograde and it's on the 0 degree of Aries, which is that's in itself is a really interesting placement, because it marks the beginning of spring and the very beginning of the whole zodiac cycle, which is said to start in Aries and go to Pisces. And so it's retrograding. And so it's like it's gonna retrograde probably back into Pisces. I've just got this as like a slideshow thing, but I could pull this up here. How's this gonna work? Okay. Keep it. So, if we go like this, let's see, like maybe go by month. This will change from August to September, right? So he was born at a time where we can go by day here. It's just moving there. Oh, no, 3 degrees, 0, 0. So he was born on, let's see, so he was born on August the 1st, so 10 days after he's born, Saturn retrogrades back into Pisces. So you can start to see this as the chart isn't just a snapshot, but it also implies what happened before the moment of the chart and what is happening after the moment of the chart. And with Saturn being so close to retrograding back into Pisces, it's like it suggests that over the course of life, like maybe it starts out with this really bitter kind of resentment and stuff like this, but eventually that there's a kind of reversal in that, and Saturn finds itself in Pisces again, and in a very
that's 10th house. That's his career house. And so the what becomes his big resentment, his big bitter problem, retrogrades into being what he's known for. He can use that for what makes Moby Dick such a powerful novel. And I mean, I haven't actually read Moby Dick, but but it's got a reputation, and I think this is a way of understanding where Moby Dick comes from in an archetypal astrological sense, is dealing with Saturn. And I mean, sometimes with astrology you can take a very literal direction with it. This is Saturn moves out of Aries and goes into Pisces, which is a more spiritual sign, and it's also a water sign represented by the fishes, right? And so he's got, his novel is literally about a giant fish. You know, I know a whale's a mammal, right? But it fits with the sort of seafaring theme of watery Pisces. And I mean, okay, let's go back to the actual chart here, though. So it's retrograding back into the 11th, from the 12th, from, if you're looking at it like this, and hopefully that doesn't get too confusing what I just did there. But at the moment of birth, he's got Jupiter in the 10th in a Saturn-ruled sign. So that also is another way of saying that what he's going to be known for the legacy that he leaves in terms of a writer, is going to be governed by that Saturn, which is in that really difficult position. But that Saturn is on the 0 degree, retrograding. It's right on the verge of popping back into Pisces. So it kind of gives this impression of a changing, kind of, you know, the retrograde reversal. It kind of flip flops from it's sort of like, you know, you could talk about, you know, you get all Jungian and talk about alchemy here. This sort of references, there's some, the alchemy, you know, turning the lead of Saturn into gold of great literature. But, you know, then of course Saturn's going to have to go back around again and then make its way back through Aries. But at this certain snapshot, that's kind of the general direction you're getting when you're looking at his life. So that's quite a lot there. Is there anything more to really go on here? I guess one of the things that's interesting about this is that I would have expected more of a 9th house thing, given with how much traveling that he did. And you don't really see I mean, the 9th house, though, with Lake and Girding, it is connected with the 10th, right? And I did mention before that 9th house Capricorn thing, that it's going to be concerned with more of a Saturnian thing, like the cold, hard, gritty nature of reality coming, you know, the lessons learned from the hard stuff, you know, having a sort of a somber respect for the difficult side of things. And you can see that, you know, the Saturn rules the 9th, Saturn rules the 10th, and so there's a connection there. That's how I would read the 9th house based on my understanding, without it having any placements. And also keep in mind that with both being ruled by Saturn, what I was just speaking about with the retrograde Saturn in Aries moving into Pisces is also going to affect the 9th house as well as the 10th house. Another really, like, just basic one is he's got Mercury in Virgo, its own sign, in the 5th house. So the 5th house having to do with what you're making, what you're producing, the creativity and play. Like, it doesn't sound, I mean, Virgo's the fall of Venus, like we were saying earlier. So, maybe as a kid, maybe he didn't get a chance to have that light and carefree childhood because he was forced into working at such a young age. But there's something about Mercury being there in a strong position that it's a bit more of a serious place, a bit more serious matchup for the fifth house. It's not as you know fun and carefree as if it was like Taurus in the fifth house, maybe. But it's it's got a association with language, with Mercury, and the craftsmanship of writing, and I think that is interesting to see because it really works well for the chart of somebody who's made language and writing their career, what they're most known for. Um, there's also something interesting here where he had one of his friends that was very close to him was this guy Hawthorne, and it was I think somewhere in here they were also suggesting that there was maybe some sort of like the homosexual dynamic going on where he kind of a bromance, but I think you can sometimes with this kind of stuff, people if they share a common passion for literature in this instance, that can bring in the shared love of something can evoke those kinds of things in friendship. But I mean, who knows? I'm not going to speculate on what the exact nature of the relationship was. But part here, I'll read a quote from a biographer. It says that Melville was infatuated with Hawthorne's intellect, captivated by his artistry, and charmed by his elusive personality. And though the two writers were drawn together in an undeniable sympathy of soul and intellect, the friendship meant something different to each of them. With Hawthorne offering Melville the kind of intellectual stimulation he needed, they may have been natural allies and friends, yet they were also 15 years apart in age and temperamentally quite different. And Hawthorne found Melville's manic intensity exhausting at times. Melville wrote 10 letters to Hawthorne, all of them effusive, profound, deeply affectionate. Melville was inspired and encouraged by his new relationship with Hawthorne during the period that he was writing Moby Dick. Melville dedicated the work to Hawthorne. In a token of my admiration for his genius, this book is inscribed to Nathaniel Hawthorne. So I think I could see this coming out again by going back to the third house with the Venus, Cancer, third house, there could be like the kind of the brotherly affection, perhaps, or maybe he was looking up to him as a father figure or something like that. Who knows? But that I don't know. Having Venus in Cancer, I think, kind of relates to these kinds of like sentimental, affectionate feelings, and also keep in mind that although the 11th house is empty, the 11th house is ruled by Pisces, which is another water sign, and so there's a kind of this sort of emotional kind of connection with the friends and allies, or the kind of people who may have a neighborly or brotherly relationship with. And then, there's something else I read here where that apparently I don't think that he really had the most satisfactory relationship with his wife either. And you've got that 7th house Scorpio and I don't know. I mean, that's something, there's probably more to look at with this chart, but I'm going to leave it at that for now because I think this has done a pretty good job here.
one last thing I'd like to add that I just thought of here is there's another technique from Hellenistic astrology which has to do with triplicity rulership. Now, unless you have any experience with traditional astrology, this is probably a concept you've never heard of before, and it would probably take quite a lot of time to explain what that is, but for the shortest way to say it possible is for it that each of these houses, based on what element of the sign the house falls in, there's three triplicity rulerships, which means that three different planets that you can look up for different kinds of topics. And so I'm looking here at the 11th house, which is ruled by Pisces. And if you look here, the 11th house, the first triplicity lord rules the hopes and aspirations of the natives. The second triplicity lord rules the friends and allies of the native. And the third triplicity represents grace, benefits, it's sort of like the good luck, the fortunate things that help the native out. And so if you're gonna use this technique, it's different. It makes a difference whether the person's born at day or night because you use a different scheme. But this is a night chart. So with a night chart, the first triplicity ruler is Mars, and that represents the hopes of the person. So if you see Mars in the second house, I mean, coming from the family history of having that much of a loss of money and bankruptcy, his hopes are probably tied in with the ability to make a buck at least. Right, sorry, I had a weird hiccup with my screen recording here. Anyway, so second house triplicity, or what the triplicity lord that rules the hopes of the native of the 11th house is Mars, and that's in the second. So again, what I was saying, he's just trying to make a buck after having that much financial hardship that he came out of at an early age. And then if you look at the second triplicity lord for the 11th house, that's Venus. And so then that brings us, what I was saying, the Venus in the third in Cancer, with those kinds of warm feelings and that would be associated with Cancer as a water sign. The kind of nurturing, motherly kind of qualities, that is getting tied into 11th house stuff with Venus as a triplicity lord. And if you really want to get into it too, well, it's kind of interesting. I'm not sure how you'd interpret this one, but the grace, the benefits, and the good things are going to be associated with the moon in this chart. And if anything, the moon is in the 8th house, which isn't a good place for the moon to be. So maybe, I mean, it's sort of, it could be trying to make, when life hands you lemons, to put it in a kind of a trite way. That's the best you can. I think I can get out of that one right now. But there you go. That adds a bit more of a connection with Venus in Cancer, having to do with his friendship. Finally, I'm going to take a quick look at some of the current transits that are going on. So this is today's chart. And I've got it set. I'm doing this in the morning, but at around 5 p.m. today, Taurus is going to be the ascending sign. But for people who are Taurus Rising, you can use this as a kind of template to get an idea of how the transits are hitting your chart right now. Of course, I mean, and this is something, if I was going to be doing a weekly horoscope for people, or something like this is basically how I'd be doing it, right? And I imagine that most of the weekly or monthly, whatever, horoscopes that people do, they're not so much based on the idea of the sun sign as they are the rising sign. Something you can do as well is you can see if these themes work for your sun sign placement if you do have a Taurus sun.
because there's a technique called derived houses, where you use your sun sign as the first house and generate topics like that. However, for a more pure form of astrology, I prefer to just stick with the rising sign for these kinds of readings. But if you're reading those horoscopes, you can do either sun or rising and see how that works for you. So anyways, let's start with Mars in the 6th and kind of work our way through it. So Mars in the 6th, Mars is in its detriment in Libra. It was kind of interesting that earlier on, like a couple weeks ago, Venus was in Scorpio, and you had this interesting thing going that they were both in detriment, but because Venus is in Mars signs and Mars was in Venus sign, you had what was a mutual reception going on. That mutual reception is not going on anymore. Venus has moved on. She's in Sagittarius now, and Mars is not getting that same kind of support from Venus. Eventually there might be it'll move into a sextile or something, but this is, this is, it is sextiling Jupiter, though, but it's sextiling Jupiter in the 8th. So it's not really the greatest kind of dynamic. But getting into it anyways, so there could be trouble here, is what I'm saying. It could be health concerns. It is like November. It could be like flu season. It could also be just somebody who's feeling the effects of being a bit overworked, I would say. Moving on to Scorpio, the sun is in Scorpio, so that could put a focus on your relationships and close. Could be a relationship. It could also be more of the one-on-one dynamic with close friends, or maybe even business partnerships. Working with a therapist or a lawyer, things where there's this more of a private one-on-one connection. Depending on what the circumstance is, anyways. And Mercury is going retrograde there, so there's something that is calling your attention. You might have to tend to some relationship issues or issues with friendships, basically, that, you have to, there's some issue that's going to need to be resolved in that domain before you move forward. Jupiter and Venus in 8th. I'm just going to keep it simple with this one, and I'm going to say that this could show up in the Taurus native's chart as they're helping out somebody with money or giving somebody some kind of support in that way. There's sort of a kind of a charitable thing, but you're kind of making a sacrifice maybe to bail somebody out. Is kind of how I'd read that. Saturn in the 9th. This is interesting because we had the big Saturn South Node thing going on all year, and we also had the eclipse seasons. If there's any Taurus Rising people here, and you have some good eclipse stories from this year, I'd be interested to hear about it. But I mean, we're looking at Herman Melville's chart, and the whole thing about that 9th house Saturn kind of thing, that there's more of a heavy, dark kind of experience of higher knowledge or understanding. It's, for Herman Melville, it was that feeling of being like forsaken by God out at sea and all this kind of stuff, and the sort of perhaps the bitterness and resentment that gets fueled into this hunt for Moby Dick or something like that. There's with the South Node there in Saturn, though, it could be, things could have gone badly the last year in certain areas, but there is a higher understanding there that's really teaching the lesson of detachment. Maybe it could also be a kind of a stoicism, learning. There could be a maturing into being able to handle the hardships of life, Not necessarily a fun time though, but it could be. Sometimes the I would say the deeper spiritual lessons can be of a Saturnian variety, because in a way, the ultimate goal, a lot of people have said about religion and philosophy, is to deal with death and deal with loss and deal with impermanence. And so I think, if any, the most positive thing about this could be a increased capacity to hold space for those heavier, more weighted Saturnian dynamics that show up in our life. And I mean, on the day that I'm recording this, the moon is there in Pisces, and so the moon is at a trine to the sun right now, so it's kind of a harmonious place for the moon to be, and that's hitting your 11th. So I would say it's it might be a good day for like catching up with some friends you haven't seen for a while, or it's making it's going to make a square to Jupiter, and coming out of a square with it's transiting a square to both Venus and Jupiter in the 8th, though. So this would play back into those themes, like your friends might be needing to get bailed out, or you might have friends hitting you up for money. I see that kind of coming up today, perhaps, as I don't know if this is literally going to happen as a prediction. My attitude towards this is I'm just working with astrology here, and if you can think about it thematically, like as a theme rather than it could be a concrete thing in some cases, but I'm just kind of going for the themes of what the chart is saying here, and you can and I'd be interested you get some feedback, what you guys think of these interpretations. So this is it for the Taurus video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back for Gemini soon, I guess.